it almost sounds like a myth because it's so strange. The hospital was built in 1911 in the heart of the woods in Maryland. And unlike every other mental institution that the state of Maryland has already constructed for white people, they decide that they are going to force their future patients to build it for themselves from the ground up. And so when the first patients arrive, there's no hospital at all. There's no ward, there's no place for them to rest, to eat. They have to build all those things.
You wrote a book, Madness, Race and Insanity in a Jim Crow Asylum. The story, according to research and what I've been able to ascertain and you have shared, you found out about this particular, and for lack of a better term, this mental facility, probably when you were a freshman in college, and
Yep.
you you were fascinated by it. Tell me about this field trip, if you would, that led you to this facility that was kept for Black patients only back in the Jim Crow era.
I was just about 18, 19 years old, a freshman on Harvard's campus, and I stumbled into a class that was all about the history of psychiatry. And I think I was
Hmm.
drawn to that class in part because of my family too, because we were so close and so loud. But the one topic that was always off limits was anything having to deal with your mental well being. You know, I had the kind of family structure that was kind of like pray about it on Sunday or go to your room and calm down.
Mhm.
And, talking about family secrets or tough memories, that was really difficult for some of my elders and even my parents. And so I think I kind of just went looking for someone who wanted to have that conversation with me. And I loved the history, but I noticed very quickly that really, for the most part, when you learn about this history, it's mostly from the perspective of white people. And so I really had to go looking, hunting for stories that represented Black people and Black families when they've needed mental health care. And I knew they existed because in my own family history and in the secrets that we kept, I knew that we had loved ones who were sent to places just like Crownsville. And so I found a network of these former segregated asylums that used to be all over the country. And Crownsville really, I guess, pulled me in because it closed in 2004. So this is a very close history, a place where there are living people and patients who can still to this day talk to you about the experience there. The buildings were still standing and are still standing in Maryland. And then there were tons of records that I could request to access from the state. And so it seemed like this unique opportunity because often what you see happen with places like these old asylums is that, you know, they shutter, they're turned into a haunted house or a Halloween ride. No one's really preserving the history and the record keeping. And this was different. And I felt like at first it was this personal mission, right? To try to find myself, to better understand Black Americans' journeys through the mental health care system and maybe just feel a little bit less alone. But then I started to realize, really, as we got closer to 2020 and I was, you know, an adult living in the real world and no longer a student, I realized I think that a lot of people want to talk about mental health right now, but I think a lot of people don't have the tools, they don't have the words, and they certainly don't know their history.
You mentioned in the book, and you also just share with us now that in your family, particularly in Black families, I think this is not that's something that is very familiar. We don't discuss mental health. I remember asking my mother to go with me to therapy, and she's like, "Why would I do that?" You know, she was like, "Why would I sit there and talk to
Yeah.
someone who doesn't know us? This is our business. You know, it's not their business." And she went with me, and I share this story because it was a disaster. And she went with me, and she was, wasn't there for it. She thought it was ridiculous, it was insulting. She didn't like this woman giving her advice. It was invasive. And at the end of the day, it was incredibly vulnerable. But I later found, to your point of going to Crownsville, and to your point about Black people, our culture not really embracing its mental history, not talking about it as a family. I later found that there was a through line in my family of mental unwellness that people did not want to talk about. And so you find this facility, you dig into its history, and you find out that Black people not only were sent there, there were Black people who actually built the facility and then later were put inside of the same facility. Explain that to me. This is so fascinating.
Yeah, it's an unbelievable. I tell people that to me it's almost like a biblical tale, right? It almost sounds like a myth because it's so strange. It's so strange and yet it's so American. So the hospital was built in 1911 in the heart of the woods in Maryland. And unlike every other mental institution that the state of Maryland has already constructed for white people, they decide that they are going to force their future patients to build it for themselves from the ground up. And so when the first patients arrive, there's no hospital at all. There's no ward, there's no place for them to rest, to eat. They have to build all those things. They're in a cold forest and they have to clear the forest. They have to construct roads. They have to move a railway. They have to pour cement and build a foundation and erect these massive big brick buildings that still stand more than a century later. I mean, that tells you just how fine the craftsmanship was, right? Like,
Of
and it
course.
immediately it raises these questions too for me of like, well, how sick or unwell could somebody really be in that moment, right? To be so unwell that they're no longer welcome in society, that they've been deemed by officials and by authorities as needing to be institutionalized, but they are so healthy that they can build a place like this.
Which
And
goes to the saying that we use. I'm sorry, but the saying we say often, we built this place for free. I literally say this about this country because it's so frustrating for people who attempt to erase America's complicated and very unfortunate history with slavery and what we were actually as this culture brought here to do, to work, to build for free labor. So here you have this facility. They say that they're unwell, but they're making them build the I can't it's just so frustrating, but completely true of America. Go on. I'm sorry.
right, and it's and so you're not surprised, but you are shocked. And
Yeah.
you know, and the thing is it's not a sort of casual occurrence. This isn't just a coincidence. Doctors had been for years, in the years after slavery, talking about Black people's bodies and minds and debating their different theories about what was going on with us. And instead of imagining that, oh, perhaps enslavement caused them a lot of mental suffering, they actually start to think, you know, emancipation was a mistake. And that's part of the belief system that informs their decision to build a segregated institution in the first place, but then to also kind of turn the hospital itself into this antebellum, you know, good old days style plantation. So even after they build the buildings, the patients then go on to run a massive, highly productive farm that grows year after year after year. They run the kitchen, they run the laundry, they run the morgue. I mean, they're running and offsetting the cost of their own care. In a way, I mean, all asylums at the time, you know, they made patients do chores and laundry and work at the gift shop or whatever it is. But often that was sort of part of a jobs program so that they could
Sure.
leave and then go have a, you know, a reference and a resume. That's not what was happening at Crownsville. This was really a recreation of the plantation structure. And doctors weren't even really trying to hide it. And that goes on for decades. I mean, well into the 60s, they're using the patients in this way. They're renting them out to private businesses, all for no or very little pay, you know, in the way that we think of prison labor now. And,
Yes. That's
you
what.
know, for
Yes.
me, and I'm curious if you'll feel this way, for me, finding this information out, as much as it made me angry, it actually also gave me a lot of compassion for people in my family who are afraid of therapy, afraid of psychiatry, maybe are a little bit
Correct.
hesitant about doctor's
Correct.
appointments, because
Yeah.
you realize, oh, my grandparents, for example, my
Yeah.
mom was born in Baltimore. My
Yeah.
grandparents lived in Baltimore. Like, they would have heard these rumors and these stories, right? And so if
Yeah. My
that's their
they
relationship
Yes.
to the system,
Yes.
can we
Yes.
be so surprised?
Yes, no, my mind as you're saying this is I'm blown away only because we are so we forget to take the extra layer and we don't know much about our history and we have to ask these questions because you know our family doesn't like to talk about it. So if our culture, if Black folks, especially during the slave period and the Jim Crow era, even up into the 60s, as you mentioned, how they were using these patients as if they were prison laborers. If there is a difficult misunderstanding, abusive relationship with therapy, mental health. Of course, we're not going to want to be willing to talk about it or be a part of a system that is really a slave system, if you will. Just we're allowed to walk around. I wonder if in your book you knew that you were uncovering the relationship that Black folks have with mental health, meaning the reason why they don't trust it, the reason why my mom's like, I'm not gonna go and see a therapist, the reason why my
I
grandmother,
think
and yeah, you know what I mean?
I know. Yeah, I think in the beginning, especially because I was so young, right? I'm just fascinated by this place and I'm actually overwhelmed by it in a way. Um,
Hmm.
but it was within a year or two of doing the research and really sitting with it, sitting with the photographs that I uncovered, the hospital records, letters written by the racist administrators who wrote the place, and state leaders who refused to let Black people work there and were actively fighting to maintain segregation. I mean, when you look at this stuff over time, you start to see just the world that your your own loved ones, your own family lived in, not even all that long ago.
Not even all
And
that long. Oh,
yeah, and I think
yeah.
it was that realization too that then informed my decision to like write a couple personal essays in the book. So in a few sections of the book, at the beginning, in the introduction, and then a couple times along the way, I bring in a couple personal family anecdotes. And I do that because, on the one hand, as a journalist, we always disclose any personal connection. And so I felt like the reader should know I come from a family with a history of mental trauma, and of an impact from racist abuse in the country. And so I wanted anyone who, bought this book to know what kind of narrator they should trust and listen to. But I think the other piece of it was that I wanted to actually honor some people in my family and contextualize their experiences or their lack of trust or their fear or their loss, because in the past we had so misunderstood it or hush hushed it or hid it. And I think so much of change for the Black community can come from seeing this history, feeling it, and knowing that it's not just your family and
Sure.
something quiet and shameful that happened to
Yeah.
your lineage. You're actually part of a much bigger system and problem, and that can hurt, but it also really does remind you you're not alone.
Yeah, and that's important because then you start to feel safe, and the work that you're talking about, the mental health aspect of the reason why Black folks don't trust, doctors, and don't want to and talk about therapy, especially when it comes to mental health. It is so connected to how this country has found new ways to make the finish line more difficult for us as a people. So first there is slavery, then there's Jim Crow, then there's segregation, and now there's this new, if you ask me, there's this new attempt to really rewrite our history. Words like DEI have become bad words, and and critical race theory. There's just always a new way to make it more difficult to understand what really happened uh, at the beginning of this country's history, which makes it impossible to get over because you have to know where you were before you know where you're going. And I think your book is such a beautiful way, and a very honest way. And by beautiful, I mean just the rawness and the realness of it, to talk about something that we don't like to talk about. Can you tell the listeners more about Crownsville, and who ran the the facility? You share some very painful
Yeah.
moments about how the white people who ran the facility treated the patients.
Absolutely. So in those early years, from about 1911 up to the mid, 1950s or so, the hospital is run primarily by or exclusively by white people, many of whom are very openly racist. I mean, open about the fact that they see the patients that they're supposed to be treating as less than human. There are tons of incidents of racial violence, allegations from the Black community of all kinds of physical abuse, sexual abuse of patients in those years, of starvation. Patients are sleeping at times head to feet, two people in a bed, like a twin bed, or they're left to sleep on benches or outside on porches, and it's overcrowded and incredibly filthy. And so, I bring you into the world in the early part of the book, and bring you into some stories of patients and challenges at the hospital, so that you can really see just how dire, and how little there was available to Black Americans in terms of therapy or care at that time. Then one of my favorite parts of the book is when things get a little bit more messy and complicated, frankly, and Black men and women start getting jobs for the first time in the 1950s and 60s. And there's this really fascinating power structure and power struggle going on, where there's still white employees who think they run the place. There's new Black employees who really know and love their patients, and in many cases grew up with their patients in their own neighborhoods. And then there's the patients kind of at the bottom of that totem pole.
Mhm.
And you see the difficult position that the Black employees kind of in the middle of all that are put in as they try to save patient lives, but also kind of bump up against the reality of a system that was created by people who don't look like them and don't care as much for them. And so it's amazing. There are all these women and men who are in their 90s, 80s, and 90s now, who still live in Maryland, who got their first jobs as teenagers or in their 20s there, who
Wow.
can still tell you the stories of being there in the 50s. And nobody, just for years until I knocked on their door and called their house a million times, nobody thought,
Yeah.
I'm not kidding. Nobody thought to give them the spotlight, the chance to talk about what it was like to be really these pioneers who come into a place with like such a difficult and sordid history like that, and to try to every day do what they could with their very small amount of power, to save patients' lives. And so, the book it's about the horror and the ugliness of that early period, but it follows it all the way through the century-long history. So you see the hospital's transformation, and I really try to center Black patients and Black employees in it, because for so long their stories haven't been the ones that we've listened to. We haven't given them their real shine. They haven't gotten their flowers, and I really want this book to change that.
You mentioned about how they started to take care of the patients in a way that only someone who really loved and cared about them could. Give us some examples of that, because I think that's beautiful as well.
Oh yeah, there are so many examples. One that I think about all the time is a woman who's still alive in her 90s named Marie Goff, who gets her very first job there in the mid 1950s. And she's assigned to work on a really overcrowded and dingy and terrible ward, working with men. And there's a guy on her ward who she gets to take outside one day, and he tells her that he hasn't seen the sky or the sun in a really long time. And so she kind of looks into his record and tries to figure out, what's his story? Why is he here? And it turns out that he was picked up by her supervisor, who was a white man, and some authorities in Baltimore, because they overheard him speaking in a British accent, and they didn't believe that there could be Black people who had British accents. And it turns out that he had been born in London and was a jockey and happened to come to the United States and then fall on hard times. But he really was British. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it's not until she sees him as a human and wants to have a conversation with him and then wants to look into his story that very basic information about him comes to light. The other story that always sticks with me is of a woman, named Betty Hawkins, who comes to work at the facility, and a patient has been complaining and complaining for years before she's arrived, and nobody's been listening to him. She talks to them and finds out that they have a phone number that they would like her to call to tell their brother to come pick them up. That's all that this patient has been asking for such a long time. So she actually does it.
Wow.
Lo and behold, the brother answers the phone, comes and gets him. They hadn't seen each other in 27 years.
Wow.
And it's just because no one had seen that patient's humanity, right? They didn't care. They didn't listen. They walked by his cell and didn't want to hear his pain. That something so simple as just making a phone call to reconnect them with their family and with people who care and love about them, that step hadn't been taken for so long. And so, one of the real messages of the story for me is the fact that when you have real community and care, and when you have doctors and nurses who look like the people they serve, who know the people they serve, who went to church with or went to school with the people they serve, the outcomes are really different. And it doesn't even have to do with technology or
Mm-mm.
new medication. It's
No.
just caring about your community that can make.
Seeing the humanity in every single person, which is what this country has taken away from Black people for so long. African Americans still ask for that in so many institutions. You've highlighted it in this book in the medical institution, but it's finance, it's education, it's the judicial system, it's every single institution in this country. If you don't have someone who looks like you making decisions, in places of power, you find yourself often marginalized and overlooked. And all it took was a phone call to get this man to see his brother he hadn't seen in 27 years. Like those stories to me are so fascinating. I wonder, you talk about this place, Crownsville, not closing until 2004. That was just 20 years ago. So whoever is listening to this podcast right now, you were alive. You should, or at least a thought, at least by the time in which this place shut down. Um, what led to its closing?
Ooh, that is another favorite part of my book, because this is the part that, oh, another important piece that I want people to really take from this is, so toward the end of the 20th century, what you start to see happen to asylums, these new medications arrive and people want to bring patients back to the community. And they feel, or at least they're claiming publicly, that they feel more sympathy for people suffering. So they come up with this plan to build community mental health care centers all around the United States and to shut down the big asylums. And Crownsville is sort of targeted as one place that needs to close. But at the very same time that this deinstitutionalization and sympathy movement is happening, the civil rights movement has exploded. Black people are protesting and getting arrested in the streets. There's a big backlash to the Black Power movement. And so more and more Black people are being funneled into jails and prisons, and they're having less access to spaces that are hospital like or therapeutic. And so one of the things I track at the back of the book is how, towards, as you get closer and closer to 2004, Crownsville almost kind of goes back in a circle to its early days of being a little bit more like a prison than it is like
Mm.
a healthcare facility.
Mm-hmm,
And
mm-hmm.
even the employees are noticing this and getting incredibly frustrated. I tell the story of one Black doctor who is on his shift one day and sees a police car come down the road and come to bring a patient to the check-in room. And the patient is a 6-year-old boy in a karate uniform, and this is in the 80s, and he's sort of like, something's wrong here. And so he talks to the police. They're like, he's been acting up, he needs to be committed to the asylum. And immediately the doctor knows something's wrong, because the boy does not appear to have any issues, there's no adult or parent with him who can give any more context, and he clearly has just come from a karate class.
Mm-hmm.
And so he gets on the phone and he has to fight a judge and talk to the judge's staff. And finally, after hours of trying to reunite this boy with his family, he's able to do that and to avoid this boy, having his, at just 6 years old, being committed to a place like this. But it starts to show you, right, that police were interacting with the mental health care system, that they were trying to choose and decide who gets brought to these institutions. And it says so much, right, about the way that they would view a little Black boy, who's coming from karate class. And even if he had misbehaved in that class, it's hard to imagine, right, what a child could possibly do at a karate class that could warrant them being arrested by multiple officers in that way and brought to really an adult mental institution. And so it's stories that really, I think, changed me, that kind of propelled me while I was working on this reporting. Because right now, when you look around our country, many communities in the United States, the primary and largest mental health care provider is a jail or prison. And many patients who struggle with schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, they will tell you, if you talk to them, that they couldn't get to see doctors or they couldn't get
Sure.
care until they were arrested for making some kind of mistake.
Sure.
And And so when you see this era in which the asylums are shutting down, the prisons are growing, and Black people are kind of being disproportionately affected by those shifts, you see that Black patients are a really important part of all these pivotal transformations toward the end of the century. And, by the time Crownsville closes, it's this really heartbreaking scene where, on the one hand, it has this difficult history. And so you want to imagine something better is coming, but you also see the writing on the wall. We didn't build the community mental health centers. All we did was build new jails, prisons, and juvenile justice centers. And I think, at least for Black folks, like, we all know what came next.
Yeah. Wow. If you could, I don't know if you think of Crownsville this way, but if you could talk about your book Madness, what is it a microcosm of? How would you describe what this book, which I think is a clear reflection of what's happening in our country and has happened in our country, what would be the correlation for you?
I think that Crownsville is not just a Maryland story, it's a truly American story, because the institution in all of those years comes to represent and reflect all of the fights this country has had over how it can live up to its promises. The basic core tenets of what America likes to tell itself it is, all of those battles are reflected in what happened to the patients and to the employees of this place. From emancipation and the fight for freedom, to battles over integration and Black people's simple right to get jobs at places like hospitals, to the criminal justice system and over policing issues in America, and then now to the current moment, post pandemic. I mean, I bring you past 2004, and I end the book with a reflection on what happened to Jordan Neely in New York City, a
Hmm.
Black young man murdered by a former Marine on a New York City subway,
Yes.
who's, the trial will come relatively soon, where he has pled not guilty, and we'll see what a New York City jury decides. But I reflect on that case because for so many Black Americans, it came to represent the intersections of all these things and the culmination of really a century of this history that I think some people know in their families, they know in their stories, they know even from their own experiences in these facilities around the U.S. But we haven't quite named it, we haven't quite spelled it out. And I guess the other way I'd put it is that we think a lot about the slavery to prison pipeline or the slavery to school to prison pipeline. But I would argue that the asylum, that the mental health care system is on that timeline too. And so we need
Hmm.
to think a lot more about why it has all these connections. And if we all want a better mental health care system in the future, I think most Americans of every background know that this system isn't serving any of us, not just Black
Sure.
folks.
Sure.
Well, I think you need to know what went wrong before you can build yourself something better going forward.